Thank you. Thank you very much, Jürgen. I have to say I'm really deeply honoured to be here today as a simple paediatrician amongst so many eminent animal scientists and veterinarians. I've enjoyed the preparation of this meeting in discussions we had with Waltham and Richard Butler. So thank you very much for all the engagement, and also jointly with my co-speaker this morning with Dr. Alex German. And hopefully what we will have this morning is this exposition of how animals and humans differ or compare, and I think it's really exciting what has been done with the new pet growth charts. So, my talk this morning is about promoting healthy growth in children. As Jürgen introduced me, I'm a paediatrician, mostly in clinical practice these days, working in a lot of disorders of growth and endocrine problems in children. But I've had a long-standing interest in the science of human growth and how children grow. And we had a wonderful opportunity beginning about 8 years ago to start redeveloping growth charts for the UK based on a number of the international developments I will be talking about. So what am I going to cover this morning? First, we're going to talk a bit about making growth charts, how we use growth charts, and some of the challenges that we have to face with how the population changes, and not just weight, height, puberty. And then also this issue, the challenge that I have as a clinician is the interpersonal variation and what to do particularly around the adolescent phase. So what about making growth charts? Where do growth charts come from? Well, the very first growth chart actually that was published was probably around about 200 or so years ago from the center of France, from near Dijon. There was a famous French naturalist called Comte de Buffon, who wrote the Histoire naturelle, a lot about birds and the other environment. And he was working with a junior worker called Philibert Guénaud de Montbéliard, who was also observing birds, and the discussion presumably between them went, well, why don't you look at how a human grows and how a human changes? And that's what happened. And hence we have this first ever recording of human growth, which is one of those things which actually is quite remarkable, really, given the fact that there's not been very much, for many, many years, there wasn't very much development. I'm going to move forward to about 200 years or so to the WHO multi-center growth reference study, because I think that's very key with regard to the way in which we understand and use, I suppose, growth charts and measurements in children today. Because there was this discussion around about 20 years ago within the international community are there similarities in children's growth, or do we need to take into account a lot of racial and inter-country variations? So the WHO set up this study looking at selecting infants born in 6 areas around the world: California, Brazil, Ghana, Norway, Oman, and India. And they selected the children for optimal growth. Those were non-smoking mums, high socioeconomic status, and one of the really key things as far as human beings go is being breastfed, because most of the other growth charts up until then had been based on bottle-fed infants. There was a longitudinal section to it, so in other words, the same children born serially, measured serially, and also those who were just measured once or twice to increase the numbers in the whole study. And from that, the WHO published the growth charts 0 to 5. It's based on this principle that, well, is the way children grow the same, and can such a type of standard be applied worldwide? And what about, from comparing with the younger children and infants, what about older children? Does the same apply? This is where we get to a bit of the technical issue and technical details around growth charts, which actually is very important to understand. The difference between a growth reference and a growth standard. So the WHO is a growth standard. So what does that mean? It is defining the way children should grow. It's prospectively collected longitudinal data, and it is constructed using the standard way these days of Professor Tim Cole, the same way in which the dog growth charts have been produced as well. The main reason for implementation of this worldwide is to look at poor growth, detection of poor nutrition in children. Whereas you see the standard type of growth chart, and the one which we refer to here, the WHO puts on its own website, is the reference chart. Now that's based on old measurements of cross-sectional data. So in other words, a lot of children just measured once and looking at the spread of height, weight, or whatever measure throughout the whole population. This is really just cobbled together from the very old 1950s US charts, which are still in regular use at the present time, have been updated. And they're really used as the default growth chart worldwide for older children where national references are not available. But they don't actually tell you how an individual child should grow. They just give you a reference point to be used at any one particular point in time. Although we will tend to sort of try and join up the dots, that's not exactly how they are constructed or meant to be used. So this is what, if you go to the WHO website, this is what the growth charts look like. They come in a whole range of different, obviously males, females. Some of them come in standard deviation scores, because certainly in mainland Europe, that's how, and many countries, that's how they use charts. In the US and in Britain, we tend to prefer the centiles. Much the same concept really, is just familiarity. In length, one of the slight problems that is the WHO decided that there would be a transition between measuring children's length at 2 years of age and height. So that's why there is a slight dip there, because when you measure children lying down, they're actually slightly longer than they are when they stand up. But that's what they look like if you go to the WHO website. What is quite interesting really is actually the variance across different parts of the world. And one thing which is quite striking, if you look at the length of the children here over the first 2 years of life, this is the longitudinal study, is how similar it is. There is only 3% of variance between the various 6 sites, much more inter-site variation than there is intra-site variation than there is inter-site variation. And that's a really important statement, and I think what it does, it confirms that human growth really is independent of racial origin, and because there's this major debate as to whether we should be using growth charts which reflect one particular ethnic group or the other. I mean, the only thing that does vary is BMI or weight, where there are more inter-country variations, as we'll come to see. So where are the WHO standards being used? This is the latest use chart that I was able to get hold of. So where it shows in green, there's a lot of uptake for the WHO growth standards. Some countries who don't adopt it either have their own, which they feel is perhaps more appropriate, or maybe there are other developments taking place. But as you can see, this has been a major success, and it's something that has been taken forward quite significantly. In the UK, we had a look at this in detail because there was some data on breastfed infants. The old charts that we used to have were based on bottle-fed infants. And we decided actually that the WHO was, in many cases, a really good fit for the way in which British children should go. And this is what the British charts look like. We have the standard measures of weight. This is infancy from birth to the first year of life, and this is from the second year of life up until age 4. In the UK, there's a national surveillance programme for height and weight in children to try and track obesity, which begins age 4, so we just use a different set of standards for that. We have, which we're going to come to in a minute, 2 other areas which we differ slightly from the WHO standards. One was birth weight, because British children tend to be slightly heavier. And there's also sections on how we actually handle preterm birth or prematurity. But what's quite interesting on this section here is this is the weight panel, which you'll be seeing a bit more with the puppy growth a bit later on. Actually, how the pattern of weight in children changes. The humans are around about 3.3 kilos at birth, and towards the end of the first year of life, they're approximately between 9 and 10 kilos. So you've got a tripling of weight in across that first year of life. Massive, massive changes. In length, there is about a 50% increase. Infants are about 50 centimetres when born, and about 75 centimetres at the end of the first year of life. And the head circumference, which shows very rapid growth in the first stage, reflecting brain growth, around about 33 centimetres, going up to about 46 centimetres, about a third increase across the first year. So massive changes, and it's important that we can now document that accurately, and the WHO growth charts have been actually, in many respects, a real major step forward, because we're now being able to detect obesity in infants to a much greater extent. Also, we're now looking, because these reflect breastfed babies, we're now not castigating mothers whose babies grow more slowly, because the old charts were more based on fatter, heavier, bottle-fed infants. So they are a lot better all in all. What about older children? These are the charts that we use for older children now, these are the ones that, through the working group of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, that we have developed. We're not just looking at height and weight, we're looking at actually quite a number of features which help us to try and determine childhood growth. This is the chart up until age 8 and 9 in boys, where we have the WHO data up until age 4. Then, because the WHO data then don't really exist at that stage, there's a step which we then move back to the old British data, which has been revalidated for the population. We have our birth centiles, and we also have other ways of trying to gauge how big a child is going to be when they're older, one based on a regression based on the parental size, and also a regression analysis based on the child's current centile that can predict their adult centile. One of the things we also have across the top is a way of trying to track a child's BMI, because one of the things, certainly with humans, when you're trying to look at the balance between height and weight gain and general physical development, it's actually quite helpful. One of the best indices we have is BMI. So how do we use growth charts on a regular basis? Well, firstly, I think one of the key things we've got to do, and one of my campaigns, is to get children measured properly. Because there's an awful lot of what we call pirate measurement taking place, children not being measured properly. As you can see, I'm sure if you can see here how wrong things are. This is how one should do it technically. On each of the growth charts, there are standard illustrations of how to measure children. The head steady, feet no shoes, standing straight against a calibrated bit of measuring equipment. This is the gold standard of measuring equipment, the Harpenden stadiometer. But there are many other devices around which are equally good, some of which don't need calibrating. So height is one thing. Sometimes one finds in clinical practice very poor measuring technique, and here you can see why you don't get accurate measurements. This child who's misbehaving with her head tipped down over here on tiptoes with shoes on. Believe you me, this actually happens, and this is why. And this is one of the things we have to try and campaign against, to try and get accurate measurements. As I would say to the medical students when teaching them on growth, if you ever see this happening, you have my permission to tell the person off. So what about measuring babies and younger children? Well, with the length, we have particular length measuring tables where we measured both lengths together with someone holding the head, and that gives us... The challenge here is the WHO standards go up to age 2, and trying to actually keep on top of a struggling toddler who's just under age 2 to measure their length is quite a challenge, but that's the way the standards are constructed. This is how not to measure length in children. with one leg, nappy on, head waving in the breeze. You will never get an accurate measurement like this. What about weight? I don't think when you weigh puppies and animals, they have nappies or other bits and pieces like that, but humans usually do. And you've actually got to use electronic scales which are zeroed with whatever mats you want to put inside. But the babies and indeed younger children need to be weighed completely naked. Slightly older children can be weighed in very light clothing. But this sort of approach, techniques which we sometimes see from time to time, is not accurate. Because actually, if a baby's got a full nappy, that's the equivalent of about 2 weeks weight gain. And so it's actually really important to actually get them stripped off, and usually certainly in clinics, baby clinics, and measuring and hospitals, their weighing rooms are usually much. So one of the things that we have to look at when we're trying to assess the growth of infants is whether they're premature or not, and whether they're born at what's called term. So how do we define term? Term is approximately 40 weeks, and the timing is based on the mother's last menstrual period. You could also do gauging how old a child is gestationally with ultrasound and obviously antenatal tests and things like that. But term is generally defined as between 37 and 42 completed weeks. But because there is quite a wide, as there certainly is quite a wide variance in size, you have to make some compromises here. So we tend to say, well, all term infants should be plotted at time 0. And therefore we have these, certainly over here in the UK, we have particular birth weight centiles. And after that, we move on to the WHO. But there's also a special set of centiles for those who are slightly premature, so going back down to 32 weeks, which are on the left-hand side of the chart. Because actually, as you can see, in this last stage, in the last trimester of pregnancy, there's massive weight gain in humans, and that can have a big impact on how engages the well-being of a child, and also whether you decide whether they are actually born small for gestational age or not. So we've developed a particular way of trying to handle the transition when you've got a preterm infant. So we would plot, this is the use, this is, for example, from the Royal College of Pediatrics information that we produced. You show a preterm infant gaining here. Now, when they move to the term section, to acknowledge the fact there is some degree of prematurity, we will actually be able to show a drawn back method here so that we can actually plot them twice at the actual age in weeks, and also the gestationally adjusted age in weeks. The reason being is if we don't do that, you can sometimes get errors. It looks like this infant is failing to thrive with dropping down 2 centiles here. But it's just that the first plot is gestationally adjusted and the second one isn't. So if you plot them correctly, you can see this infant is actually growing very nicely. So that's an important factor, how we use the growth charts. We also, in human growth, we have quite a lot of infants who are born extremely premature. And that's back right down to 23 weeks of gestation. That's regarded as the limit of viability for human beings. So there have been developed a special set of premature growth charts which are used, where you actually, again, with these ones used slightly differently, we work out where the estimated data delivery is and calculate the prematurity backwards. They're quite helpful. The only problem is that these are based on old, ultrasound measurements and not the measurements of preterm infants. There is a study going on to look at that, to actually have better standards which will better reflect postnatal growth. So what about with society? How does that affect children's growth? How do we assess weight trends? Well, we know very well that in many countries, we heard yesterday very clearly from Professor Dronowski about the changes and the societal effects on weight. We had a big think about whether we should acknowledge the fact that children's were heavier and to incorporate that in the growth charts. We decided not to, because if you take the premise that obesity is pathological, we want to try and improve obesity, so therefore we decided to keep the growth standards the same as they were on the previous generation, but just extend the BMI chart upwards. So here we have the 50th centile right down here. Now you can see with children, we use the initial range in adults between about 20 and 25 as the normal range, but we track it back, and children are quite lean with a nadir around about 6 years of age. So we actually need, it's not the value of the BMI that's important for children, it's their centile. And now we also are seeing quite a number of children who get really high with high BMIs of 46 and above, plus 4 SDs, which is incredibly worrying. The assessment of BMI is actually in many respects quite easy now with the new lookup that is available on the charts. We just need the weight centile and the height centile, and we can calculate the BMI centile. This is a new lookup which is available on the growth charts. And this is how we use it with the lines across the top. We can actually track an intervention in a child who happens to have a problem with being overweight and gaining weight, and we can track exactly how, which is much better than using weight in its own right. The effect of child growth on in the population, it is often been quoted as reflecting the window on the population health. And we do see a trend in children's growth over time. And I think one of the best examples, I just chose to show one example here of the growth of Japanese children across the 20th century, showing a gradual trend in height upwards, children being taller than their parents, as one tends to see anyway. Other than this gap in the 1940s, 50s, due to the troubles, obviously, subsequent to the last war. But I think it's very important to know that how important assessing children's growth is as a monitor of how well a society is doing. And I think it's very well illustrated by this. We're also seeing with children getting bigger and heavier, a change in the onset of puberty. And that's best marked by the age of menarche, onset of periods in girls, something that's readily recallable. And there's data published over the last sort of nearly 200 years shows a significant drop down to between 12 and a half and 13 at the present time. There is some debate as to whether that's getting younger or not. It seems to vary from country to country and also place to place. The data, there hasn't been as yet a large scale cross-continental studies, but certainly children seem to be going through puberty earlier. What about interpersonal variation? It might be fun, I'm sure, to have toy dogs and these small species, or cats and things like that. But as far as human beings goes, this is a real challenge. When you've got small people, they really do stand out, and there is quite a social stigma with the very small individuals, usually due to particular genetic or hormone resistance problems. But across society, we've got 3 famous British comedians here who produced a sketch on television available on YouTube about the effect of height on your prosperity, your income, and how you actually manage to get on in life. And there certainly still is this height gradient. The taller you are, the better you are, the more affluent you are, the more likely you are to get to higher positions in society. What is quite interesting with human beings is actually how tightly controlled the growth processes are. I noticed in the US a few years ago in the endocrine meeting, we went to the Museum of Modern Art, and there was this wonderful gallery which was completely empty, and everybody who went into the gallery was measured, and their height was put against the wall by an assistant, and over time this scum mark came around the whole the gallery wall. And I think this is quite fascinating, really, the fact that most human beings, other than a few children, most adult human beings are within a tightly controlled height band between about 5 foot and 6 foot and life is governed to be round about that, really. And I think deviations from that do cause problems both socially and environmentally as well. Now, what about growth in normal children? This has been one of my fascinations over years, and particularly when you're looking at growth charts. There are actually very few longitudinal growth studies in children. There's only one in the UK, a detailed one, which was conducted from birth to maturity, and that was the Edinburgh growth study. And here we have growth patterns of 100 boys, 70 girls. And we can see that there is quite a lot of consistency in growth in childhood. A few wobbles we'll come to in a minute. But when you get to puberty, the adolescent growth spurt, the growth charts go everywhere. It's very difficult to predict pubertal growth. But when you get to adult height, everything gets brought back in again, as we see from that last illustration about the normal range of human growth. We do see quite a lot of variation in growth, and this is one of the things that's fascinated me. Generally, children grow with height or weight rapidly in the first year of life. There's this plateauing in childhood with this extra growth spurt in adolescence. But actually, this plateauing or this steady growth in childhood is actually not as steady as we first thought. There are some variations from year to year in children's growth, and you can see from these individual patterns based on this sort of time series analysis. And actually, how children should grow, one of the things that I described some years ago is pretty much in this Loch Ness Monster type pattern where there is quite a lot of little growth spurts. So you may notice that if you have children yourself, how they actually do grow in 1 year and then a slow growing year. This is one of the things that we now recognize in the way that children grow. There are also some environmental effects on growth, looking at the subtleties, within a year. Those measurements we had looking at the growth changes are from year to year, annualized measurements. I love this study from a Japanese mathematician who looked at the growth of his 5 children, all in different colors here, across the various places where they were living. Each of the vertical bars is a year demarcator, and the measurements and the black lines in between are the result of the time series analysis that he did on the children's growth. What is fascinating are 2 things really. One is how different children are in their own patterns of growth. And secondly, how reproducible it is in individual children from 1 year to the next. They all grow pretty much in exactly the same way. So there are obviously lots of factors that we don't understand about how, in this case, children grow, and what are the other factors which trigger children's growth at particular times of the year. So I think this is important, and I don't know whether this is the same for puppies and animals as well. I'd be interested to know. Children have this growth spurt here, the puberty growth spurt, but it appears that this doesn't happen so much in animals, and even with the great apes. Because if you look at this upswing in the adolescent growth spurt, it doesn't seem to happen in the great apes. And maybe that's something that distinguishes or differentiates the human pattern of growth from animals. I think it's also interesting how we actually look and how we're trying to ascertain and understand how the changes of growth take place. I had been showing you either just height or weight charts, or also just laterally height velocity charts, looking at the actual changes from year to year. What I find particularly fascinating is looking at the height acceleration to try and understand the changes of growth. And let me take you through this, because I'm sure we all like fast cars and going faster, but the growth takes place, it accelerates at different stages. This is the growth velocity chart of one boy, and here we have various numbers on the adolescent growth spurt. 1 is what we call takeoff, 2 is maximum acceleration, 3 is peak height velocity, and there's the maximum deceleration. And it's much clearer to see this on the acceleration chart, where of course 0 acceleration is actually no change in velocity. So that can either mean that you've stopped growing completely, or you've stopped changing the speed of the way in which velocity changes. So 0 equates to 1 here. Also at 3, when you've got the fastest growth, you've actually stopped accelerating. So what actually is really quite fascinating is number 2, really, and also potentially number 4. What are the factors which actually contribute to this massive acceleration that we see here in children during the puberty growth spurt? It is quite relevant, really, when you come to consider what to do about the extremes of population growth. Because although we produce growth charts which reflect or have reflected standard children's growth, there's quite a lot of variance one sees, and this is from a British study. We're looking at the height here of the earliest developing cohort in the British ALSPAC study, and also these are females here. As one can see, around the mid-teenage years, you've got quite differences in the way in which children grow and the expectation. And also, socially, and particularly when children are getting towards the sort of middle teenage years, that can have quite a marked effect on their well-being, and also, as we can see here, so what the expectations are. Those who attain sports prowess and academic achievements tend to be those initially who are the ones who grow fastest. And it actually is quite important to understand actually what happens to the growth of later developing children. As we can see, this is the adolescent growth spurt. The shape of the adolescent growth spurt changes the later it is, so that it becomes not a little bit flatter, perhaps not quite so intense, so fast is the growth. So one does get that comment to me from people who come to see me in the clinic, from parents saying, well, I don't think my child, my son, my daughter has grown very much. Actually, they have grown. It's just that you notice the growth spurt in later developing children less. And also the total pubertal growth, as you go, at the later normally it's about 20 to 25 centimeters, but the later a child goes through puberty, the less they actually grow during that pubertal growth period. So when we've come to look at the new UK growth charts, we've actually tried to focus quite a lot more about puberty and to try and actually think about this a little bit more, to give some more clinical guidelines. So we've actually introduced quite a lot of changes, the first of which is what we call puberty lines, because it's always been a bit vague to understand when children begin puberty and when they stop, and how you actually marry those two things together when you're assessing growth. So we have on the growth chart these things called puberty lines, which give you the second and 98th centiles as when children should start puberty and when they should complete puberty. We've also taken a different approach to trying to assess puberty in adolescents, which may well be relevant, I suppose, for the animal world as well. There is a very detailed clinical scale called the Tanner scale, which is really for use in specialist practice. But in reality, we can assess puberty either in 3 phases. Pre-puberty, so there's no signs of any sexual development taking place at all. Going to the other extent, completing puberty, which in females is when periods have started with other secondary sex characteristics, and in males, largely when there's obviously physical changes of puberty in the genital changes, but also a lot of voice changes as well. When you've got a lot of testosterone around, that's when a male has completed puberty. And in between, we call in puberty, because that allows one to assess a child's growth potential. It actually makes quite a difference, and we've been experimenting with different sorts of growth charts to actually look at how the difference of phase in puberty affects growth assessment. Here we have the standard growth charts, UK growth charts, in grey lines, and the other lines here we have are the 99.6th centile and the 0.4th centile, which have been split apart based on the phase of puberty. And as we can see, in this early teenage years, it makes quite a difference. If you've got an early developing boy here, the 99.6 centile is 13 centimeters bigger than someone who's in pre-puberty. And over here, if you've got, again, a short but early developing child, he's going to be in the region about 15 centimeters taller than a boy who is this stage, is not yet gone through puberty. So the the position of a child in puberty makes great difference as to where and how you assess their growth accurately. And this is what we've incorporated in the chart, because one of the ways in which growth charts are often used at this stage is to look for growth abnormalities. So here we have the 0.4 centile, which defines shortness. Now, it depends very much whether a child is prepubertal or not, whether they're normal. So here we have an additional 0.4 centile for prepubertal children, and that allows us to differentiate between what could be a normal and what may just be due to a maturational phenomenon. Still, if you're below the 0.4 centile, that requires a workup. But it's just one way of trying to differentiate pathology from normality. And at the top end of the scale, we've got the same. We have another area where we just see the growth for normally developing children. The earliest you expect a child to go through, in this case a boy, to go through puberty. And we've also got, obviously, as I mentioned before, the puberty lines which define the latest stage. So what we've introduced latterly is this incorporation of this maturational assessment into growth assessment, which is something that's the first time this has been done in any country in a systematic way. Finally, I know with puppies and animals and cats, I've been quite interested in a number of the presentations here, and we'll hear more in a moment. There is neutering that happens, and neutering has a major effect on growth, it appears. What about children? What about neutering children? What happens to growth in neutered children? Well, actually, if you think about it, this childhood phase is in a neutered individual. The reproductive axis in children is very active within the first few days of life, and also in particular with boys, up to about 2 months of age. The reproductive axis is there's quite a lot of testosterone around. We think that might have a little bit of a growth spurt in boys, but we're not really sure. There's a lot of research on that at the present time. Then we enter a period of quiescence. And then if we talked after that, then puberty happens. But what happens if you actually block that second phase of pubertal development? What actually happens to growth then? Well, there is a situation where we are actually, that actually happens in clinical practice with transgender children who are not happy and really often disquieted by their physical development and changes. And during the process of psychological assessment as to whether they want to remain in their chosen gender long term, then at that stage, puberty can be blocked using gonadotrophin releasing hormone analogues. And in the clinic that we run, we've actually been looking at to try and look at what happens to body composition changes. Here we have a number of girls, natal girls, those who are transitioning to be male. This is the body composition changes over a year period of time when they're on GnRH analog and puberty is stopped. And we see that there's a gradual acquisition of fat mass overall over the group. Obviously, there's a bit of some of the individual variation. In males, the opposite seems to be true. There's a drop, certainly, in BMI initially, followed by a bit of a stabilization. So this is initially just the first year. This is very preliminary data, which we're just beginning to collect. But we're seeing quite a difference here. So we're seeing that with those who are born as male, they slow in growth and they lose lean body mass. Those who are born female and you block the adolescence of females, they're actually putting on more fat mass. So it appears to be that hormonal blockade in late puberty has different effects on body composition, and it's also different from middle age. So as we go through middle age, our sex hormones drop and our body composition changes. This is quite different, and we don't know what the reason for that is, whether it is the fact there's greater growth hormone effects in children at this stage. Well, more to come, but it's also very interesting with this neutered, the effect of growth in neutered animals. So finally, just to finish off, I like the Johan Karlberg model of infant growth because it really separates out these influences in childhood growth quite clearly. Between, I'll just go back 1 minute. Between infancy, which is largely nutritionally driven, very similar to the growth in pets. And then we've got this area in adolescence, and this variable stage in between, which is during a time where children haven't very much in the way of sex hormone influence, and there are a lot of societal and environmental effects that might happen there. And I think this is where, putting it all together, we have quite a challenge to try and understand children's growth, and also to reflect how this should be assessed better, and also the way in which we can also instigate better monitoring and also treatment and pick up problems with growth a lot earlier. So I've had a lovely opportunity to go through what I feel about how children's growth is and how it should be, and also look forward to see how we can then compare and contrast with animal growth in the next session. So thank you very much indeed.